August 1592. A Portuguese ship, far from home waters, damaged by French pirates, full of exhausted men, is discovered by an English squadron. The Madre de Deus, which means Mother of God, was returning from Goa and was sure to have high-value cargo. The English squadron, essentially state-sanctioned pirates, had the backing of the most powerful woman in England, Queen Elizabeth I. After tracking the Madre de Deus for a while, the English made their move and attacked. What they discovered would change the course of history, not just for England, but the entire modern world. Among the cargo was a bale of pepper so valuable that selling it in London would give you enough to purchase a small town. From that moment, the door to the modern world swung open. The age when humanity became richer, healthier, cleaner, better fed, and better protected from disease than at any other time in history. Now, some people hate hearing that. This is, of course, me riffing on the British Empire. But stick around, and I'll back up every single claim that I just made. Now, if you've seen my previous video, the one where I traced the birth of our entire news culture back to a single moment in 1641, you will know this isn't the first time Britain stumbled into something civilization defining. It's what we do. But here, this is where that pattern truly begins. An entire way of life. A way of life unlike any ancestor at any point in time can be traced back to this very stumble, England's stumble upon serendipity. What the English discovered on this ship made them realize something. In fact, it was a discovery so huge, it equaled half the Crown's total revenue for an entire year. Not only that, it was around 10% of England's GDP. In today's money, up to a staggering £45 billion worth. It made them realize there was a wealth of wonders out there in the world, and their conquest to discover, to conquer, to master led to the greatest empire in history. But that empire was not one of oppression, it was one of liberation. Liberation from famine, liberation from malnutrition, from the historical curse of seasonal starvation that every civilization before simply accepted as normal. And yes, if you've watched my BBC monologue, you'll know exactly why our institutions refuse to tell this story properly. They prefer guilt over gratitude. But the facts are what they are, and this is where they start. The variety of food that nourishes you, the access to capital that built your house, schools, hospitals, nightclubs, the textiles that clothe you. All of it stems from the pioneers of the global market, the British Empire. But how? How did this magnificent cargo lead to all of that? This is the beginning of modernity. So what exactly was on this Portuguese ship called Madre de Deus? Well, spices, silks, gems, textiles, ivory, porcelain, perfume, dyes, and enough Asian luxury goods to rival a nation's treasury. But Queen Elizabeth understood that England was missing out. She understood that unless her nation pivoted, it would be terminally stunted. And so just a few years later, after constant petitions from merchants with specialist knowledge who needed royal approval to trade in the East, to negotiate treaties, to raise armies, build forts, and operate under a monopoly, well, Queen Elizabeth finally backed their venture.
My merchants came to me with risk and opportunity. I gave them a charter, and they gave me a world.
And the venture Queen Elizabeth granted royal charter to on the 31st of December 1600, the one that helped create the modern world, was called the East India Company. Investors, called adventurers, bought shares in each voyage and received profits or losses when the ships returned. Crucially, these shares were transferable. Merchants, aristocrats, minor gentry, shipbuilders, even foreign investors could sell their stake, making it one of the very first stock markets on Earth. It was the tech startup of the 17th century, backed by royal power. But their success was about to meet real enemies, and not just overseas. The East India Company's maiden voyage in 1601 was a shock success. Commanded by James Lancaster, returning in 1603, delivered profit margins of 500%. This single success created instant hype in London's merchant class, and capital poured in to follow-up voyages as a result. But early success was not smooth or consistent. The English faced far superior competition, as well as many other tribulations. The Dutch were far richer and far more organised. The Portuguese heavily resisted in the Indian Ocean. Disease killed between a third to half of all crews. On one voyage, half the crew died before the Cape. The other half limped home barely alive. Things became so fraught between the English and the Dutch that by 1619, the Dutch had completely driven the English out of the Spice Islands, seized English ships, sabotaged their access to cloves and nutmeg, out-invested them dramatically, and in 1623 butchered English merchants. But this conflict simply caused the English to pivot. Instead of trying to beat the Dutch in spices, the East India Company shifted towards Indian textiles, cotton, silk, and opium. Across India, in Surat, Madras, and later Calcutta, the English dug in. This dramatically changed the fortunes of the English. With India, the East India Company became a continental trading empire, a mass importer to England, and eventually a territorial power with military capability. But there was still the issue of the mighty Spanish and Portuguese. Fortunately for the English, though, their approach would win in the long run. Why? Spain and Portugal used state empires, meaning they used government-owned fleets, royal commanders, direct crown conquests, and colonies as extensions of monarchy. Whereas England used a corporate empire. The ventures were funded by investor capital, where investors take the risk. The Crown's involvement was to grant monopoly privileges. It's the company that negotiates its own treaties and raises its own armies. This is why England overtook Spain and Portugal in the long run. Spain and Portugal sent royal and state employees, whereas England sent entrepreneurs. And speaking of long run, by outsmarting their competition, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. Within 10 years of the incorporation of the East India Company, they were recognized as an Asian trading power. Within 30 years, they were entrenched in India. Within 60 years, they were richer than Portugal. Within 100 years, they were wealthier and more powerful than pretty much any European state. And within 150 years, they were controlling millions of troops and pretty much the whole of India. And the more dangerous the seas became, the more men in England realized there was money in predicting risk. And so, from this enterprise spawned new enterprises. Meet Edward Lloyd. In the late 17th century, sometime around the 1680s, Edward set up Lloyd's Coffee House. Lloyd's became the hub of East India Company related information. We're talking ship departures, arrivals, cargo manifests, risks, losses, rumours, premiums. At a time when the East India Company was sending million-pound cargoes across the world, into war zones, facing storms, piracy, Dutch competition over journeys lasting years. When you're involved in the game of sending cargo worth more than the Crown's annual income through oceans full of storms, warships and pirates, you need more than just luck. You do need luck, but you need intelligence, which is precisely what Lloyd specialised in. He made his shop incredibly useful to all manner of people, from ship captains to market speculators. It's reported that he would employ young lads, send them down to the docks to garner as much information as possible. And because of this, he kept lists of ships, read incoming reports out loud, posted arrival notices, hosted captains, insurers, underwriters, welcomed company men, merchants who needed risk information. So what started with East India Company shipping risk turned into the world's first maritime insurance exchange, the origin of cargo insurance, the rise of modern underwriting, and eventually the creation of Lloyd's of London, now a global giant handling trillions in insured value. And so there you have it. The East Empire is out of the gates. The precocious era of British dominance dawns. Your entire way of life, the fresh water you drink, the motorised carriages that transport you, your heated house, the ingenuity began here. But what about the West? Of course, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese. Well, they're already West. Enter the last absolute monarch, the man the Union flag was named after, the first King of England and Scotland, the man that put his name to the most voluminous book to have ever been printed, the English Bible. Yes, King James. King James VI of Scotland and King James I of England. The man who inherited Elizabeth's crown, her kingdom, and her unfinished ambition. The man who believed a monarchy ruled by divine right, yet oversaw the birth of the most anti-authoritarian nation in history. So, what did James want? Simple. Spain was choking the Atlantic. Portugal still held the East. The Dutch were bloody everywhere. England needed a Western foothold, and James needed it without paying for it. The treasury was empty, war debt was everywhere, and Parliament was getting hostile. So he simply did what his predecessor did, what Queen Elizabeth did in the East. He outsourced empire to investors. A company for the West, a company to settle, to trade, to extract, to explore. The company wouldn't cost him a penny. He called it the Virginia Company. It's worth noting something. James adored Elizabeth, which actually is surprising considering Elizabeth ordered his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, to be executed. But he owed his place on the throne to her. But he also knew she never cracked the Americas. So he wanted a legacy that she didn't have. A new world colony, with his name on it, his achievement, and his flag, planted in the soil. And so in 1606, with a stroke of a quill, he issued the charter that sent 104 Englishmen into the unknown. They called their settlement Jamestown, after the king, who signed their commission. And then everything went wrong. Jamestown wasn't a colony, it was a coffin. It was a swamp, mosquito infested, saltwater poisoned, crop killing, disease ridden hell. Half the settlers died in the first months, more died in the winter. Then came what was known as the starving time. People boiling leather shoes for food, digging up the buried for food. James's great western venture was on the brink of disappearing into the mud. But fate turned, and like all turning points of fate, it came from one man, not a lord, not a knight, not royalty, but a farmer's son. And this is where a single life, a nobody from nowhere, changed the fate of 2 continents. John Rolfe. An ordinary man with an extraordinary bit of luck. Shipwrecked in Bermuda, nearly killed twice before he ever saw Virginia, he arrived in Jamestown with a strange idea in his pocket. A few seeds of sweeter Caribbean tobacco, different from the harsh native leaf the English hated. He planted them, they grew, they thrived, and they sold. Virginia suddenly had a product, a cash crop, a reason to exist. Rolfe's little experiment changed the entire destiny of Britain's Western Empire. Tobacco made Virginia profitable. Profitable made it permanent. Permanent made it expand. And that expansion turned what was a dying swamp into a little old thing called the United States of America, all from a joint stock company, all under a king who wanted his own stake in glory, all from the hands of ordinary men who, by accident or ambition, stumbled their way into history. And so when we talk about empire, when we talk about the East and the West, we're not talking about maps or flags or paintings. We're talking about something much bigger. We're talking about the moment the world broke open and ordinary people rose with it. A small island plugged itself into the world's supply of food, ideas, metals, medicines, fabrics, sugars, spices, crops, credit, and capital. The effect was staggering. Within a century, the British were eating better, living longer, working better jobs, wearing better clothes, and surviving winters their ancestors would have perished in. Because when Britain opened the world opened back. This is the long true story, the story they don't tell us anymore. But the result of the British Empire isn't just British prosperity. It was a rising tide for every nation tied to the system. Global life expectancy rose. Child mortality collapsed. Calorie intake soared. Perhaps a little too much for some. Disease fell. Commerce stabilized. Prices normalized. The foundations of the modern world, logistics, insurance, credit, medicine, public health, are all emergent properties from these very networks. And that is the punchline. You live in the safest, richest, best fed, best clothed, longest lived human age in history. And you can trace the origin of that rise to the moment British merchants, backed by 2 monarchs and a nation hungry for possibility, stepped beyond the horizon. And don't forget, if you want the next chapter, the next piece of this puzzle, watch the video that's currently up next on the screen.